Welcome to Biblical Cultists, where I review books that I find interesting in topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. In this episode, I'm going to go over the famous work of Ibn Rushd, also known as Averroes. But first, please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. It would really help the channel out. So, On the Harmony of Religions and Philosophy by Averroes is a classic of philosophy and theology. Now, like I always say, find an edition that works for you. This particular edition I would like to mention is the type of book that sometimes we encounter, in the sense that it has no publisher listed, it has no translator listed, it literally has no information. So it is badly formatted. There is a long introduction to the work and it doesn't tell me who wrote it, when they wrote it. So you kind of go into the book in a somewhat confused fashion because it is very difficult to tell how the book was put together. So obviously it is a famous work, and I did check and confirm that the text was accurate based on a search online of legitimate sources and translations of the work, because you could get a very badly translated work or even a wrong work with the correct title. So once you encounter these kinds of books, and it has happened to me many times in the past, because you get a lot of these self-publishing works, or a lot of people that take books that are no longer copyrighted and they just publish it themselves, put it together and throw it out there. And when you go to a bookstore or an online shop to get a book, usually if it has good reviews, or in general, if it seems okay, you get it, and then that's when you realize that the book has no information. So do find yourself a better edition, but I did confirm that the text within is correct. Now, since I don't have a publishing date, I'm going to just mention the fact that the original work was written and finished around the year 1180 of the Common Era, or of the Christian era. And I'm going to go over the thoughts, concepts that are within the work. Obviously, it's a very small book. Most of this particular edition is a commentary, but I did find actually the commentary very good. I just would have liked whoever wrote it to have signed it, to have given some information. But I did find it actually good, because it gives you a good overview of the thought patterns and concepts involved in Averroes' quite complex beliefs and philosophical conclusions. So the first thing that stood out to me is the fact that he uses the transcendental argument, which is the argument that all reasoning assumes an objective truth, that all conceptual thought implies universality. So that when we have an argument, when we are discussing, when we are debating, when we are formulating ideas and presenting them in any way, there is a general assumption by all involved that there is such a thing as universals that we can utilize, that there is an objective world that does exist, that language has meaning, that it has shared meaning, and that together we can come and understand through something called reason, which is really a metaphysical category. So that when we engage in any kind of conversation of this type, we are doing metaphysics. And that in that metaphysic, there is an objective reality behind it. It is not subjective or relative. So when skeptics and atheists and postmodernists engage in conversation, and postmodernists understand this actually, which is what makes it interesting, they are in fact engaging in a presupposition of objective reality, which denies their entire philosophy. So I found it interesting that from this point, that argument is there, and Ibn Rushd was aware of the fact that that's how thought functions. So again, I know that there are plenty of people that may disagree with this from a philosophical point of view, but like I always say in my reviews, I stick to the book itself. So obviously I am arguing from that position because that is the position being presented. Also, in the book, there's a discussion of causal relationships, because there is the issue that was quite important at the time, which is whether or not the universe and the world is eternal. We must remember that Ibn Rushd is taking information from the Greeks. He is incorporating philosophy from the Greeks into the Islamic worldview, which itself is controversial, even to this day. You can find plenty of videos online of Muslims discussing this very issue. But at the time that this was happening, it was a big deal. So you have Muslim philosophers and theologians trying to understand Aristotle and Plotinus and a lot of these very interesting conceptual thinkers, and they're applying them to the Abrahamic milieu. And what you find is usually this problem of the eternality of the universe. I have done reviews on other Islamic philosophers that are somewhat contemporaneous, and this is an issue. Another philosopher that comes to mind and theologian is Ibn Arabi, because Ibn Arabi tends to agree and believe a lot of the philosophical presuppositions of the Greeks. So then he talks about the universe being eternal, which could be fairly argued is a contradiction of the Islamic point of view. And here Averroes goes into that point and argues, of course, that this idea of the world being eternal implies an infinite series of movers. So there's not a single prime mover, there's an eternal, infinite series of movers that will never end. But as we all know, from the Abrahamic point of view, there must be a first mover. And therefore, this eternal universe conception, which is very common in the East, is rejected. But of course, he will go, as you read the book, you'll see that there's a discussion on how to address this problem. Another problem is the problem of duality, because when you have duality, you have unity. So you have this dichotomy there. And because duality implies relations of necessity, then finding any plurality in God would be problematic. At any point when you see plurality or multiplicity, it would require another being that would be the source of the unity, or at least the being that does the uniting or the joining. And this is how you get to the idea that God must be a lone being with no attributes, and he can have no universals that he shares with other beings. Because the moment he has universals that he shares with other beings, then he himself would require another joining, another pivot point from which the multiplicity is again joined. So from this point of view, if any creature shares a universality with God, then that is not the ultimate God. So that's how you arrive at divine simplicity, which we all know comes from the Greek philosophical tradition. And because of that, you do find believers in this in scholasticism. So absolute divine simplicity rears its head at this point because of the influence of Aristotle. And Averroes is himself responsible for bringing Aristotle back into Europe during the 13th century via the translation of his works into Latin. And the moment this happened, suddenly the works of Aristotle became a big deal. And Averroes himself being the one of the founding fathers of scholasticism, which I find to be historically mind-blowing, because now you can see a lot of the arguments that Ibn Rushd makes in his work. You see it reflected in the Summa of Aquinas, for example. But there's a direct relationship. Now, of course, Aquinas does differ in some points from Ibn Rushd, but it is clear that the influence is there, and it's not really a questioned issue. Now, as a side note, I did find the list of the types of deduction that were common at the time, but one of them I think is related to this issue of divine simplicity and universals, because there's one deduction called the habitual deduction, which argues that all existing beings are generated by other existing beings, and that any being who generates another that is dissimilar to itself cannot exist. that it is impossible to find a being who generates other beings that are dissimilar. And this would lead to the idea that God does not exist. And to me, that's very fascinating because there is an argument, especially by Christian Orthodox theologians, that once the West went this route through Ibn Rushd, then into Aquinas, into absolute divine simplicity, they have opened the way for atheism, because their argument is that once you have this kind of God who is so separate, so simple, with no attributes, etc., you're almost speaking of a non-existing God. It's an absolute negative, so separate from existence itself that it's almost as if he doesn't exist. So the attempt to protect God from any attributes or shared universals with creatures puts God in a position of non-existence. And that argument is being reflected in these discussions at the time. And I found that interesting because a lot of other Islamic theologians would say, no, not everything is dissimilar between God and creation. So today in the Islamic world, the only ones that truly believe in absolute divine simplicity would be the Shia Muslims, but not the Sunni, at least not the majority. But to see that discussion at the time, to me, is very interesting. And that leads me to the last component of what really stands out and is really the focus of Averroes in his work is his exegetical work on the Quran. A lot of it has to do with the way he manages predestination, because he points out that the Quran has a few statements that imply absolute predestined futures and other ones that imply free will. He tries to harmonize these two ideas in a way that you will eventually see also in Aquinas, which is this notion of God's knowledge of all the possible alternatives and therefore a pure foreknowledge of everything, but simultaneously not being influential per se on the decisions that human beings take in their free will. So you have options and you just pick an option. He's not influencing you to pick that option, but he's the one who gave the options and he knows the result of all the consequences irrespective of which option you pick. His other discussion also in the Quran is about sin and behavior, because there is also a discussion, and you see this also in Aquinas eventually, the scholastics go into this, of whether or not sin or virtue is only defined within the confines of divine revelation, or can it be also defined outside of divine revelation? Because some would argue that you can only know what is good by what God tells you is good, and you can only know what a sin is based on what God tells you is a sin. But because of the influence of the Greek philosophers, there is this notion of natural law, that God created a universe with inherent good and evil within its processes, and therefore by observing nature and reality you can come to a conclusion of what is good and evil, which they call natural law. Whereas very strict orthodox believers in revelation would argue that natural law does not really inherently possess any good or evil, but that you can only understand good and evil via divine revelation, because it has to be something that stems from outside of creation, which is inherently disturbed or crooked, or at least subject to change and time, which itself creates confusion. But revelation is going to be a clear dicta from God telling you what is right and what is wrong, and that's where you must remain. Whereas scholastics and clearly Ibn Rushd is arguing that this is not tenable, and that through natural law you can actually find out and discover what is true, what is good, and what is evil. And this discussion has lasted until this day for sure, because even to this day that is a big topic of discussion. So like I mentioned, great book. Find yourself a good edition with a good introduction that at least gives you some biographical background on Ibn Rushd, and then go into not only this work but any other work that you can find online by him. And I think you will really enjoy the discussion, and it will also give you a perspective that a lot of these topics were well discussed in the past, and I would even argue better than they are today in some respects. So again, please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. It really helps the channel out. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.